Ethan Cole, a wealthy and arrogant businessman, finds himself stranded on a deserted road with a flat tire. Expecting help from no one, a young black boy suddenly appears and changes his life forever. What started as a simple act of kindness grew into a story you won't believe. The sun hung bright over the deserted road, and the air shimmered with heat. Ethan Cole, a wealthy businessman, stood next to his black SUV, squinting against the harsh light. The front tire of his car was completely flat, and the situation had pulled him out of his comfort zone. His tailored suit, normally a symbol of power, clung to his back with sweat, and his perfectly polished shoes sank slightly into the dusty gravel. Frustration simmered just beneath the surface. "How could this happen to me?" he muttered, tapping impatiently on the roof of his car. He pulled out his phone and looked at the screen. No signal, his lips pressed into a thin line as he weighed his options. This was not how a man like him was supposed to spend his time. Suddenly, he heard something. A sound breaking through the silence, the rhythmic crunch of footsteps on asphalt. Ethan looked up and turned around, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, where the shimmering heat blurred everything, a silhouette appeared. His heart skipped a beat. Who could be walking here, in the middle of nowhere? As the figure came closer, Ethan saw a young black boy. He looked no older than 14, wearing a worn-out t-shirt and scuffed sneakers, carrying a backpack that seemed almost as old as he was. Despite the heat and the dust, the boy walked with purpose, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Ethan frowned. He felt both relieved and wary. The boy stopped a few meters away. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, his voice friendly but with a hint of playful curiosity. His sharp eyes studied Ethan as if he already knew what was going on. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to asking for help, especially not from a stranger. He looked at the boy, at his worn-out shoes, and felt a twinge of shame. Finally, he said, "Not really. My tire's flat." He nodded toward the front tire, hoping the boy would take the hint. The boy glanced at the tire, then back at Ethan. "Do you have a spare tire in the trunk?" he asked simply, his voice calm, as if he'd handled situations like this before. Ethan gave a curt nod. "Yes, I think so," he replied, his voice less confident than he wanted it to be. Just as Ethan was about to say something else, a sudden sound from the edge of the woods caught their attention. A low growl echoed, and Ethan looked up, startled. The boy remained calm, his eyes fixed on the bushes. A moment later, a stray dog emerged, its body thin and its eyes fierce. The animal seemed to be searching for food, adding an uneasy tension to the encounter. "Don't worry, sir," the boy said, slowly opening his backpack. He pulled out a piece of bread and tossed it a few meters away. The dog sniffed the bread, took it, and disappeared back into the bushes. Ethan exhaled in relief, but felt a strange sense of dependence. "You seem prepared for anything," he remarked, his tone slightly mocking. The boy only smiled. "My dad always says you have to be prepared, sir. You never know what you'll come across on the road." And then something happened that Ethan never expected. To his surprise, the boy walked straight to the back of the car and opened the trunk. He pulled out the spare tire and tools with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Ethan watched, half skeptical and half fascinated. He felt uncomfortable as he stood there, watching someone else solve his problem. "Wait," Ethan began, his voice sharper than he intended. "Do you really think you can do this?" The boy looked up, a wide grin on his face. "It's just a tire, sir. My dad taught me how to do this. No problem." He turned back to his work, not waiting for a response. Just when you thought things couldn't get more interesting, Ethan noticed something unexpected. Ethan stood silent, unsure of what to do. His usual confidence seemed to melt away under the blazing sun and the unexpected assistance of this stranger. But as the boy worked, Ethan couldn't help but notice something strange, the ease and calm with which the boy moved. "Why are you helping me anyway?" Ethan asked abruptly. His question came out harsher than he intended, as if he was trying to put a barrier between himself and the help he hadn't asked for. The boy looked up, his hands covered in dust. "Because you need help," he said simply. "That's what you do, right? Help people when you can?" Those words hit Ethan harder than he cared to admit. So simple, so straightforward. Yet it was something he didn't understand. In his world, no one did anything without expecting something in return. His eyes lingered on the boy, who continued his work as if he were doing nothing extraordinary. Within minutes, the boy had replaced the tire. He stood up, wiped his hands on his t-shirt, and smiled. "That's it, sir," he said. But just when you thought their encounter had ended, Ethan did something that changed everything. Ethan pulled out his wallet and took out a stack of bills. "Here," he said, holding the money out to the boy, "for your help." The boy looked at the money and slowly shook his head. "No, sir, that's not necessary," he said, his voice as calm as when he had first arrived. "I just hope you have a good day." With those words, he turned around, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and walked away, back down the empty road. Ethan stood there, speechless. As he watched the boy's figure disappear into the distance, he felt a strange sense of unease. Why had this boy helped him? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that he owed him something? At that moment, Ethan had no idea that this simple encounter would change his life forever. The engine of the SUV purred softly as Ethan drove back down the empty road. His thoughts, however, were far from calm. The boy had replaced the tire, saving him from hours stranded under the blazing sun, and then refused to accept any reward for his help. It unsettled Ethan. People never did something without expecting something in return. Yet, this boy had. Why? As the miles rolled by, Ethan glanced at the passenger seat. There lay something he hadn't noticed before, an old, worn-out backpack. It had to belong to the boy, forgotten in the rush to leave. Ethan sighed and pulled the car to the side of the road. He got out, picked up the backpack, and unzipped it. The contents surprised him. A few schoolbooks, a notebook filled with sketches of machines and cars, and a simple lunchbox. In the notebook, he saw handwritten notes in pen. "Always keep learning. Dad says it's the key." Ethan stood still for a moment. The words hit him in an unexpected way, reminding him of something from his own past. A promise he once made but never kept. It was years ago. Ethan was just starting out in the business world and had taken a young intern under his wing. The boy had been smart, ambitious, and full of dreams. But Ethan hadn't given him the chance to prove himself. Instead, he had pushed the boy aside in his own race to climb to the top. He had buried that memory, but now it resurfaced with full force. He closed the backpack and looked at the empty road ahead. A voice in his head whispered that he should just keep driving. After all, this wasn't his responsibility, but that voice felt weaker than ever. And just when he thought he could leave it all behind, something strange happened. He felt like he owed it to the boy. Ethan turned the car around and drove back slowly. The road seemed longer than before, the sky above him heavier. He kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for the boy's silhouette. Just when he thought he wouldn't find him, he noticed a side path he hadn't seen earlier. It was barely passable, overgrown with bushes and grass. Something told him to take it. The SUV creaked as he followed the path. After a few hundred meters, he stopped in front of a small, run-down house. The paint was peeling from the walls, and the roof sagged in places. Yet there was something about the house, an air of pride despite its condition. An old bicycle with a broken chain stood by the door. Ethan got out, holding the backpack tightly, and walked to the door. The silence around him felt deafening. Why did this feel like standing on the edge of a major decision? He hesitated before knocking. The silence that followed seemed endless, but eventually he heard footsteps on the other side. The door creaked open, and there he was. The boy. His face lit up when he saw the backpack. "Oh, I lost that," the boy said, taking the backpack carefully. "Thank you for finding it." But just when you thought this was a simple story of a chance encounter, everything changed. Ethan nodded but stayed standing. Something kept him there, as if the conversation wasn't over. "I wanted to thank you. In another way," he began, searching for the right words. "What you did today was remarkable." The boy smiled. His eyes held the same calm as before. "It was nothing, sir. My dad always said you help people when you can. Life's hard enough." Ethan glanced over the boy's shoulder into the house. The living room was small but tidy. A few old pieces of furniture, a worn-out couch, and a photo on the wall of a man with a broad smile. "Is that your dad?" Ethan asked, nodding toward the photo. The boy turned to look and nodded. "Yes, sir. He passed away last year, but everything I know, I learned from him." And then something happened that Ethan never expected. The words struck Ethan harder than he anticipated. He thought of his own father, who had always pushed him to succeed at any cost. "You've learned a lot from him," Ethan said softly. "That's clear." "May I come in?" he asked suddenly, before realizing how strange it must sound. The boy hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. His trust was disarming. "Sure, sir. Come on in." The atmosphere inside the house was warm, despite its simplicity. Ethan felt a strange sense of peace, as if he had found something he didn't know he was missing. But just as he thought he could close this chapter, he felt a new tension. Ethan had returned the backpack, but the path he chose led to more questions than answers. What did this encounter mean? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning of something much bigger? Ethan drove down the narrow road, the SUV suddenly feeling heavier than before. Tyrell's words, "You help when you can," echoed in his mind. He had found the boy, returned the backpack, but something still felt incomplete. The encounter had stirred something in him that he couldn't ignore. Was it guilt? Or was it simply the realization that life was about more than success, power, and rewards? He looked at the horizon, but it was hard to imagine where this was all leading. Tyrell hadn't asked for help. He hadn't wanted anything in return from Ethan. Yet here he was, back at the small run-down house the boy called home. Ethan felt the weight of his own choices pressing down, but what did he have to lose by giving someone a chance? Just when you thought the decision would be simple, tension began to build. Why did this feel like more than just an opportunity to help the boy? Ethan knocked on the door of the house. The door creaked open, and there he was again, Tyrell. His face was unreadable, but his eyes revealed something. He knew Ethan was there for a reason, but he wasn't sure what it was. Ethan felt a chill run through him. This wouldn't be easy. "Ethan," Tyrell began calmly, "why are you here?" Ethan looked at the boy. Was this the right choice? Why did he feel so uncomfortable? He had everything he wanted, yet here he was, uncertain. He swallowed, as if there was a blockage in his throat. "Tyrell," he finally said, his voice lower than he intended, "I want to make you an offer. There's an event for young talent in a few days. I think you should be there." The boy said nothing, but curiosity flashed in his eyes. It took a moment before he spoke, and when he did, the words were not what Ethan expected. "Talent?" Tyrell asked slowly, his face unreadable. "What do you mean by that?" Ethan took a deep breath, a brief silence filling the air. What was the right way to explain this? Why was it so hard to find the words? "I see something in you," he finally said, "something I don't see often. What you did today, without expecting anything in return, that says a lot about who you are. I think you're capable of more than you realize." Tyrell looked down for a moment, rubbing his hands together. That's easy to say, but they won't take me seriously. I've got nothing, just an old backpack." His words seemed to cut through Ethan, and the young man felt a wave of frustration rise. Why was it always so hard to break through? Did he really have the courage to help him? Just when you thought Tyrell might retreat into his doubts, he looked at Ethan, his eyes deep but with something else. Determination. "I don't know if I belong there, but I want to try," he finally said. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. "I understand your doubt," Ethan replied, his voice now tinged with urgency. "But that's exactly why you deserve this chance. It's not about that backpack or those worn-out shoes. It's about who you are and what you've shown. You have something to offer. I believe in you, Tyrell." Tyrell looked at him, uncertainty still written on his face. "And what if I fail?" he asked, his eyes wide with fear. "What if I stand there and get it all wrong?" Ethan felt a pang of sympathy, but at the same time, he realized this doubt gave him a chance to do something good. He stepped closer. "What if you don't fail? What if this is the chance you've always dreamed of, but never dared to take?" Tyrell's breath hitched for a moment. Was he really ready to risk everything for an unknown opportunity? Ethan's words hung in the air, the weight of expectation pressing heavily on his shoulders. This was the moment. This was his choice. Just when you thought Tyrell might reject the idea, he broke the silence. "And if I can't handle it?" His voice now sounded almost lost. "What then?" Ethan felt uncomfortable, but he couldn't stop. This was more than just an opportunity for Tyrell. It was something for himself, for both of them. "If you can't handle it, I'll stand by you. I'm not here to tell you it's easy. But if you try, you're already further ahead than you think." Tyrell hesitated. It was clear to see. His eyes searched the ground, his hands clenched into fists. But there was something else in his stance. A voice in his head whispered, Maybe I should just try." Ethan felt his heart race. "You're really asking me to go? There, to that event?" Tyrell asked with a hint of cynicism, but there was also a glimmer of hope in his voice. Just when you thought the decision had reached its conclusion, Tyrell turned, grabbed his backpack and said softly, "Okay, I'll do it. But you have to promise not to leave me." "I promise," Ethan replied, his voice heavy with sincerity. This was more than just a chance for Tyrell. This was for both of them. The journey they were about to embark on was irreversible. Ethan sat in his SUV, the sound of the engine the only thing breaking the silence. Tyrell sat beside him, his eyes fixed on the road, though his thoughts were elsewhere. Ethan had promised to help him, but the pressure he felt was greater than ever, not just for Tyrell, but for himself. He had become deeply entangled in his own past, and now there was no turning back. The road stretched endlessly ahead. The air was heavy, the asphalt radiating the heat of the afternoon sun. Ethan glanced at Tyrell, whose face appeared calm, but there was a silence that felt charged, as if something unspoken lingered in the air. Tyrell knew there was something Ethan hadn't told him, but he didn't bring it up. It was almost as if the boy already knew this moment would come, that Ethan would have to face his past. Just when you thought the silence would go on forever, Tyrell broke it. "Ethan, why are you helping me?" The question was unexpected, but his tone was calm, almost as if he'd always known this moment would come. Ethan glanced quickly at the boy, his eyes darting from the road to Tyrell and back to the horizon. It was a question he had asked himself many times but had never answered. Why did he feel compelled to do this? Why did he want to help Tyrell, even if it might cost him something? "I don't know exactly," Ethan said, his voice lower than he intended. "But maybe it's because I know what it's like to not get a chance. Maybe it's because you have something I never did. A chance to be different, to do more than just survive." Tyrell looked up, his eyes sharp but without judgment. "So this is your way of making up for what you've done?" he asked, his voice no longer calm but tinged with doubt. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. It wasn't an easy question to answer. "Maybe," he admitted, his voice fragile. "But I want you to know, Tyrell, I'm not trying to fix what I've broken. I want you to know you're not my project. You deserve this. You have it in you to do something, and I want to give you that chance." Just when you thought the truth between them could finally be shared, Ethan slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. Tyrell looked up, surprised by the sudden stop. "Ethan, what's wrong?" he asked. But before Ethan could respond, the sound of his phone broke the moment. It was a message. Ethan glanced at the screen and felt a chill run down his spine. It was from the same journalist who had been spreading rumors about his past. The words on the screen were brief but piercing. "You have no idea what's coming." The tension in the air was palpable. Ethan looked up at Tyrell, who was watching him closely, as if he had sensed the shift in Ethan's demeanor. "I should have known this wouldn't just go away," Ethan said, his voice low and heavy with unease. Tyrell, who had seen the message, didn't ask questions, but his gaze was resolute. He had seen enough of Ethan's past to understand that changing the future wouldn't be easy. But he didn't want Ethan to back down. This was the moment of truth for both of them. "Let them come," Tyrell said calmly, his eyes now full of confidence. "If they want to know who you are, let them see. You've chosen to move forward. You didn't choose me for nothing." Ethan looked at Tyrell and felt his confidence grow. It was a strange kind of reassurance, something he hadn't expected from someone as young as Tyrell. The boy understood things Ethan couldn't even explain to himself. Maybe this was the moment where everything changed, and maybe he wasn't as alone in his struggle as he thought. Just when you thought the road ahead might clear, Ethan's phone buzzed again. It was another message from the journalist, this time with a photo of a younger Ethan from a much darker chapter of his life. The image was sharp, the eyes unmistakably his, but the man in the photo bore no resemblance to who he was now. It was a reminder of the choices he had made, the people he had sacrificed to get to where he was. "They're trying to break you," Tyrell said suddenly, with not a trace of doubt in his voice. "Let them try. You're stronger than that." Ethan felt his heart pounding in his chest. This boy had something he didn't, a strength not to hide from the past, but to look forward, to believe in the future, despite everything that had come before. "Yes," Ethan said, his voice firm, "we're moving forward, Tyrell. And you're right, I won't let them win." They drove on, the road ahead gradually becoming clearer. The horizon offered no easy answers, but it was a direction they would face together. The air was heavy with promise, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it as a team. Ethan walked slowly through the hotel hallway, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. The past few days had worn down his nerves, but this moment felt different. This was the reality he couldn't escape. He had given Tyrell a chance, but now the weight of his past felt like chains around his wrists. The world was watching, and the journalist who seemed to know everything had crossed his path. Suddenly he stopped, his gaze falling on the door to the conference room. It was here, the confrontation he had dreaded. The air was thick with tension. Ethan turned to Tyrell, who stood beside him, but there was something different in the boy's eyes. The doubt that had once been so visible seemed to be fading. "You're right," Tyrell said softly, but his voice was firm. "You've always told me to face my mistakes, but you haven't faced your own yet." Ethan looked at the boy, and for the first time, he realized Tyrell wasn't just his mentee, but his equal. "I know, Tyrell," he said, his voice hollow. "I'm trying to make it right." Just when you thought the conversation couldn't take another turn, a sharp voice rang out behind them. "Ethan Cole," the voice said. It was the journalist. "We need to talk." Ethan turned around, his heart skipping a beat. The man who had been trailing him for weeks stood there, his expression anything but friendly. Ethan hadn't expected him, not this soon. The journalist had everything he needed to expose Ethan's past to the world. "Why are you trying to expose me?" Ethan asked, his voice unexpectedly loud. "What do you want from me?" The journalist smiled coldly, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I just want to tell the truth, Ethan, about who you really are. About what you've done to get here," he said, his tone cutting. Ethan felt sweat bead on his forehead. This was the moment he had feared most. The truth about his past was threatening to surface, but it felt like there was more to this. What did this man really want? Why now, at this exact moment? "If you think you know the truth," Ethan said calmly, "then you're right. But you don't know everything." "That's true, but I want to know everything," the journalist replied, stepping closer. "Everything you've done to crush your competition. You've ruined lives, Ethan. People lost their jobs because of you." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The truth he had tried to bury was now inevitably coming to light. He wanted to push the man away, but something held him back. Tyrell watched Ethan, his face unreadable, but his eyes reflected a mixture of doubt and understanding. It was clear that the boy didn't fully grasp his mentor's past yet. But what if he did? What if Tyrell discovered who Ethan truly was? "What is it you really want?" Ethan asked, his words cooler than he felt. "What are you hoping to achieve?" The journalist's smile faded as he stepped even closer, his voice lowering. "I want to know why you keep pretending to be someone else. You've hurt so many people to get here. Why do you need to hide that from the world?" Just when you thought the tension couldn't rise any higher, Tyrell stepped forward. "It doesn't matter what he's done," he said suddenly, his voice strong. "What matters is what he's doing now." Ethan looked at the boy, surprised. Tyrell's gaze didn't waver. His words were unexpected, but they struck the perfect chord. This wasn't just a boy following his lead anymore. This was someone finding his own voice. And Ethan felt the weight of his past press heavier, but Tyrell's support was clearer than ever. "Why would you still help him?" the journalist asked, his eyes filled with disbelief. "What makes him different from the rest? Why would you protect him?" Tyrell's gaze was fearless. "Because he's shown me that people can change," he said with conviction that silenced the journalist. He's made mistakes, yes, but he's trying to make it right. You should see that." Ethan felt both relief and overwhelming gratitude. This was the moment when he needed Tyrell's support the most, and the boy hadn't hesitated to speak up. It wasn't just a defense of Ethan, it was a declaration of the trust they had built. But the journalist wasn't done yet. "Do you really think people will believe you?" he asked mockingly. "That you can rewrite your past with pretty words?" Just when you thought the confrontation had reached its peak, another twist emerged. A second journalist stepped forward, her eyes sharp, her question direct. "Ethan, how do you plan to make up for everything you've done? What are you doing to prove you've changed?" Ethan felt the pressure mount again, but this time he was determined. He wouldn't stay silent anymore. He would tell the truth, not just for the world, but for himself and for Tyrell. He met the journalist's gazes, his voice steady. "What I've done can't be justified," he said firmly, "but what I'm doing now is trying to repair the damage. I don't want my past to define the future. This is my chance to prove that you can always choose a new path." Tyrell looked at Ethan, his expression now filled with understanding. "If you don't try, you'll never know what you can achieve," he said softly. "You taught me that." Ethan felt a wave of gratitude for the boy who now not only supported him, but challenged him. Tyrell had awakened something in him that he had long buried, the courage to look forward instead of back. It was a moment of mutual understanding, but just when you thought they were finally on the right track, something unexpected happened. A sudden chill ran down Ethan's spine. The door to the room creaked open. Tyrell, standing beside him, didn't turn, but Ethan felt the tension rise. What was it? His eyes darted to the door, and there stood the journalist. His cold smile was anything but welcome. "Ethan Cole," the man said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "Do you really think you can escape your past?" Ethan felt his breath catch. Tyrell's words, the promise of change, suddenly felt fragile. The journalist had found them, and this time it wasn't just a question, it was a warning. The confrontation was inevitable, but it would change everything. Tyrell looked up, his eyes sharp, but there was no fear in his gaze. "Be careful," he warned softly, "because whatever they do, they can't stop what we've started." Ethan stood there, suddenly aware of the world tightening its grip on them. This wasn't just their fight anymore, it was the beginning of something much larger. The silence in the room was suffocating. Ethan and Tyrell stood side by side, the tension between them thick in the air. What had brought them here? Why did it feel as though an unseen force had pushed them to this moment? Ethan felt the weight on his chest as the journalist's last question hung in the air, with the shadow of his past looming behind them. Tyrell hadn't left the room. He stood there, calm, but Ethan couldn't help noticing the concern hidden in his eyes. It was clear this was no longer just his fight. The journalist's words, the confrontation with his past, it was all more than they had anticipated. "What if this breaks everything, Tyrell?" Ethan asked, his voice raw with tension. "What if it all goes wrong?" Tyrell looked up, his face still fearless, but his gaze piercing. "Then we move forward," he said simply. "We don't have much to lose, Ethan, but the people we're trying to help, they have everything to gain." Ethan wanted to respond, but his words caught in his throat. Tyrell was right, of course he was. But the walls felt like they were closing in. There was no way back now. Just when you thought the silence would end the conversation, a sharp knock echoed on the door. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be now? The door opened slowly, and another journalist, her face stern and professional, stepped in. She hadn't been expected, but suddenly the air in the room felt even more charged. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice icy with calm, "how do you think your past will affect the future of this project?" Ethan felt a cold chill run down his spine. This was the moment that could change everything, but just when you thought he had his answer ready, something unexpected happened. "What are you trying to say?" Tyrell asked suddenly, his voice filled with a steady determination Ethan hadn't expected. Why should Ethan have to answer for his past? He's here to do something good, and that's all that matters. The journalist stared at Tyrell, her gaze sharp. "And you think people can just forget everything?" she asked. "You have no idea how hard it is to earn a second chance, boy." Just when you thought the situation couldn't grow more complex, Ethan noticed the journalist's demeanor shift. Her eyes lingered on Tyrell, but something in her expression told him she knew more than she let on. It was as if she was watching both of them, waiting for a misstep. "You don't know what's at stake," she said softly, her words seemingly aimed at both Tyrell and Ethan. "But we'll see how far you get." The tension in the room was almost tangible. Ethan felt the weight of the truth pressing on his chest like a heavy stone. What if she was right? What if there was no way forward? What if this was all just a game for the media, for people who didn't care about what was truly at stake? Tyrell had something in his eyes. It wasn't fear, but something closer to determination. "We're ready," he said calmly. "If you think we'll break, you're wrong. This isn't our downfall, this is our moment." Ethan looked at the boy, his young mentor, and felt the strength in his words. They stood together, bracing against the storm, but it didn't feel like enough. The pressure was overwhelming, and just when you thought they might find the answers they were searching for, the door trembled again. Someone else stepped inside, someone who would change their lives forever. Ethan looked at Tyrell, his young mentor, and felt the power of his words. They stood together, bracing against the storm, but it didn't feel like enough. The pressure was overwhelming. The room was filled with journalists, all waiting for answers, their eyes fixed on them. Ethan felt a cold sweat run down his back. This was the moment where everything would change. The world was watching, and he had no idea what to say. What if it wasn't enough? Just when you thought they might find the words to answer, the door trembled again. Someone else entered. Someone who would change their lives forever. The room fell silent. The tension hung heavy in the air like an invisible veil. A man in a black suit, his expression unreadable, stepped inside. The journalist stilled at his arrival, and Ethan felt the breath catch in his lungs. This wasn't an ordinary journalist. This was someone who knew more, someone whose presence threatened to corner them into a place they didn't want to be. "Ethan Cole," the man said, his voice cold and controlled, "the world is still waiting for answers from you." Tyrell looked up, his eyes sharp, his hands clenched in the pockets of his worn jacket, the tension in his body unmistakable. Ethan stood there, uncertain for the first time in years. The man before them wasn't like the others. This wasn't a casual question. This felt different, as if his past wasn't just chasing them, but staring them directly in the face. The man turned to Tyrell. "And you? What do you think?" he asked with a smile that promised no good. "What makes you so special? Why should anyone believe in what you have to say?" Ethan felt his heart race. What if this was the pivotal question on which their future hung? He wanted to support Tyrell, to help him find the right words, but it felt as if his own fears filled the room. What if Tyrell failed? What if none of this was enough? Tyrell's heart pounded, but he refused to be intimidated. He met the man's gaze head-on, his expression resolute, his breathing steady. This was his moment, his chance to show that he was more than the boy the world underestimated. "Because I know what it's like to fight for something that doesn't come easily," he said, his voice now firm and confident. "And I know I'm not alone. We all need a chance to make things right." The room remained silent. Tyrell's words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan felt the weight of his words and the pressure they placed on his own shoulders. What if Tyrell was right? What if this was truly their chance to set things right? This wasn't just Tyrell's moment, it was a moment for both of them. A moment for Ethan to prove himself, not through his past, but through his belief in what was possible for them both. Just when you thought the man might respond, he held back, turned away, and took a seat, as if giving them space to react. The tension remained palpable, but the control he seemed to wield over the situation began to waver. Ethan glanced at Tyrell, who didn't look away, his determination a silent message to Ethan. This was a moment to risk everything, but perhaps it was also a moment to win everything. Tyrell looked at Ethan, standing beside him. The weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. He was no longer afraid. This was his moment. The audience began to applaud, a slow and hesitant response, but Tyrell felt a surge of pride he had never experienced before. Ethan looked at the boy who had become his mentor, his eyes filling with unexpected pride. Tyrell had found his own strength, not just through his words, but through the way he stood firm in the face of everything thrown at them. But just when you thought they had their moment, something unexpected happened. Another man stood, this time a representative of the event, his gaze sharp and scrutinizing. He looked at Tyrell and Ethan with a gaze that was anything but friendly. "Tyrell, you've told your story, but do you really think it's enough? What makes you so special that you belong here?" the man asked, his voice hardened with underlying criticism. The questions came harder, the doubts grew louder. Ethan felt the old familiarity of his own insecurities creeping in, but he knew this wasn't about him anymore. This was Tyrell's moment. This was his chance to prove himself, and Ethan wouldn't interfere. Tyrell felt the tension in his chest rise, but instead of faltering, he crossed his arms and looked the man directly in the eye. "Because I believe in myself, and I believe everyone deserves a chance, no matter their past." The man nodded slowly, his face a mask of deliberation. "We'll see," he said, but his words were no longer as confident as before. The question had been asked, but the answer had been given. Tyrell had taken his stand, and the strength of his response had made the man hesitate. The audience, once reserved, now began to applaud louder. Tyrell had changed something. He had struck a chord. The power of his words, his unwavering conviction, had made them believe that change was possible. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. This was the moment when everything would shift. Not just for Tyrell, but for both of them. "You did great," Ethan said softly to Tyrell as the boy stepped off the stage. His eyes shone with pride, his breathing still heavy from the tension. But Tyrell had done it. He had seized his chance, and in that one moment, he had proven himself. Ethan felt the weight of his own insecurities begin to lift, and for the first time in a long time, he felt there might be a future for them. But just when you thought they had their moment, another twist emerged. The journalist who had confronted them earlier now stood and walked toward Ethan, his gaze sharp. "Mr. Cole," he said with a challenging undertone, "what do you think now? Is this the beginning of your redemption or just an attempt to justify your own failures?" Tyrell looked at Ethan, but this time it was clear. This was no longer Ethan's fight alone. This was their fight. Together they would face it, and together they would answer. This was no longer the time to hide in the shadows of their past. Ethan turned to the journalist, his gaze firm. "The past is not who I am. What I do with the future, that's what matters." Tyrell looked the journalist straight in the eye and added with a smile, "And if we succeed, we'll have done something no one thought possible." The room erupted in applause, louder than ever before. This was the moment when the fight to change truly began. This was just the beginning. The room was thick with tension. Ethan felt the weight of the world's gaze on him, even before he stepped into the hall. Everything had led to this moment. The journalist's sharp questions for Tyrell, the photo of his past that threatened to unravel his life once more, and the inevitable confrontation that was now about to unfold. Tyrell stood beside him, shoulders squared, his expression resolute. The boy Ethan had once helped was no longer the same uncertain boy who had looked up to him. He had changed. Yet Ethan could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The moment of uncertainty he recognized all too well, the moment when the pressure of expectations fed the seeds of doubt. "This is so much bigger than I thought," Tyrell whispered, his voice tight with tension. The room around them was filled with journalists, cameras pointed at them, their questions ready to fire. Ethan looked at the young man beside him, who was about to share everything with the eyes of the world watching. Tyrell was about to tell his story, but Ethan could feel the weight of this moment. This wasn't just Tyrell's chance to prove himself, it was their chance to shape the course of their future. "You've got this, Tyrell," Ethan said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "Just tell your story. This is your moment." Tyrell nodded, but Ethan could see the doubts lingering in his eyes. "And what if I'm not enough?" Tyrell asked softly, his voice uncertain. "What if I can't bring the change everyone expects? What if I can't make a difference?" Just when you thought the tension couldn't rise any further, a sharp tone rang through the speakers. The host announced the beginning. "Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Tyrell Johnson." The sound of applause filled the room, but in Tyrell's eyes, Ethan saw a mix of fear and determination. The boy was about to do something he had never done before, and the world's eyes were on him. Ethan knew this step would change everything. The pressure was immense. What if he failed? What if this wasn't enough? Ethan felt words rise within him, the support he wanted to offer. But just when you thought Ethan would ease Tyrell's doubts, Tyrell turned to him, his eyes filled with determination. "It doesn't matter how I feel, does it? This is my chance, and I'm not going to let it slip," he said, his voice firmer than before. The words struck Ethan, and he felt a wave of pride rise within him. Tyrell stepped into the hall, the lights bright, the audience before him a wall of expectation. As he walked toward the stage, Ethan felt a mix of relief and worry. Tyrell had overcome his doubt, but would he hold up? Could he tell his story and convince the world? Silence fell over the room as Tyrell took the stage. The applause continued, but it felt distant. Tyrell took the microphone in his hands, the nerves gone from his posture. This was his moment. "My name is Tyrell Johnson," he began, his voice strong and steady. "I'm here because I believe everyone deserves the chance to grow, to learn, to prove themselves. I stand here today not as someone better than others, but as someone who knows what it feels like to fight for what you have. I know what it's like to try to put your life on the right track, even when it costs you everything. My father always taught me to face my mistakes, and that's what I'm doing now. I'm no longer afraid to admit that I've made mistakes, that I've stood in the shadows, and that I've sacrificed myself for others." Just when you thought he had proven his strength, a sharp voice called out from the audience. "Interesting story, Tyrell," a man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But what makes you so special? Why should anyone believe in you?" The room fell silent. Tyrell felt the weight of every gaze on him, but this time he felt no fear. He looked the man directly in the eye, his heart pounding in his chest. It was now or never. "I'm not just another face in the crowd," Tyrell replied, his voice firm and commanding. "I'm here because I believe every chance matters. And if I can inspire someone, that's all I need to do." He let his words hang in the air, his gaze steady, unflinching in the face of confrontation. The man stared back at him, but his words died in his throat. There was something in the power of Tyrell's words that even the harshest doubts couldn't overcome. The audience began to applaud slowly, hesitantly at first, but it grew louder. Tyrell had shifted something. He had claimed his place. Ethan stood at the back of the room, his hands in his pockets, but a smile played on his lips. This was the moment. This was what it had all led to. Tyrell had proven himself, not through perfection, but by sharing his truth. Just when you thought Tyrell had his moment and the conversation was over, another journalist stood, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "Mr. Cole, do you think this moment for Tyrell reflects the truth? Or is this just a temporary victory?" Tyrell looked at the journalist, his expression calm, but this time he didn't turn to Ethan for answers. "This isn't a temporary victory," he said calmly, his voice filled with confidence. "What we've done is real, and this is only the beginning." Ethan felt a fresh wave of respect for the boy who stood beside him. They had faced the storm together, taken this chance together, and together they could achieve anything. The room erupted in thunderous applause, this time full of conviction. The people in the room had seen what Tyrell had achieved, and Ethan felt a strange peace wash over him. This wasn't the end of their battle, but it was the start of something greater. The crowd was still buzzing with excitement after Tyrell's powerful performance. The air was charged with energy, but for Ethan it felt as though the room was closing in on him. As he moved through the throng of people, he could feel the journalist's eyes burning into him. The questions weren't over yet. Tyrell, walking beside him, seemed to handle the situation better than Ethan had expected. His gaze was steady, his posture upright, but there was something different in his eyes. The innocence of a boy who had just begun to believe in his voice had been replaced with something stronger. The realization that he might have more influence than he'd ever imagined. Just when you thought the storm might settle, the whir of an unfamiliar camera broke through the noise. A journalist pushed through the crowd and headed straight for them, her eyes locked on Ethan, though her words were aimed at Tyrell. "Mr. Johnson," she asked sharply, "what makes you think you can make a difference now, in this moment? Do you have the strength to keep fighting, or are you just another temporary face in the crowd?" The question came out of nowhere, but Tyrell didn't respond as Ethan had expected. Instead of retreating, a calm and determined answer came from his lips. "I'm not a temporary face," he said, with a smile Ethan hadn't seen coming. "I'm here to stay, to share my story, and to show that every chance matters. If I can inspire someone, that's all I need to do." The journalist's sharp gaze lingered on him, but her words faltered. There was something in the way Tyrell spoke, something that seemed to undermine her own doubts. It was clear this was another defining moment for Tyrell, not the uncertain boy of the past, but someone who had proven himself. Just when you thought it was over, another man raised his hand from the crowd. Ethan recognized him instantly. It was the same man who had threatened them earlier, the one always hunting for sensational headlines, always seeking a weak spot. His eyes gleamed with excitement as he turned to Ethan. "Ethan Cole," the man said with a smile that was anything but kind. "What do you make of this new turn in the story? Is this about real change, or just a shiny package hiding a rotten past?" The question was cutting, but this time it wasn't just Ethan who felt the challenge. Tyrell stepped forward and locked eyes with the man. "My past doesn't matter," Tyrell said, his voice filled with determination. "What I do today, that's what's important. What I say today, that's what counts. If you don't get it, that's your problem, not mine." Ethan felt a jolt run through him. Tyrell hadn't just answered the question, he had taken control of the situation. This was a different moment. The past no longer held them back. The future was being defined by what they would do together. The man hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty, but he said nothing more. He hadn't anticipated this response, and the strength of Tyrell's words was undeniable. Ethan looked at the boy beside him, a smile playing on his lips, but his eyes held something deeper. This wasn't just a gathering. This was the day everything began to change. Just when you thought the situation had calmed, a loud bell rang. The doors to the hall opened, and a staff member holding a note entered. "Mr. Cole," she said urgently, "we need to speak with you. There's something you need to know." Tyrell glanced at Ethan, but Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What now? Hadn't it been enough? Why did it feel like every step they took dragged them further into a game of power and control? "Let's go," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "Let's find out." But just when you thought things were cooling down, something happened that Ethan couldn't have foreseen. As he walked down the hallway, he was stopped by another journalist. She looked at him with a mix of curiosity and impatience. "There are rumors, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice low but urgent, "that you've done business that's hurt a lot of people. What do you have to say about that?" Ethan held his breath, and for a fraction of a second, it felt like everything around him froze. This wasn't just a question. This was an attack on his integrity. He felt as though his past had finally caught up with him. Just when you thought Ethan might crack, he looked at Tyrell, who stood beside him, his gaze strong and unyielding. Tyrell showed no fear, no hesitation. He looked directly at the journalist, his eyes resolute. "What Ethan does isn't easy for everyone to understand," Tyrell said calmly. "But what I know is that he deserves the chance to make things right, just like I was given my chance." Ethan felt a surge of emotion in his chest. This was the moment where he would either lose everything or win it all. But Tyrell's support was a beacon in the storm. Together, they would show the world that change was possible, no matter how hard it was. "This isn't just my story," Ethan said, his voice now steady and full of conviction. "This is our story, and we're the ones deciding what comes next." The room fell silent. The journalist's eyes were fixed on them, but Ethan knew one thing for certain. Together, they had everything to gain. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the conference building, but for Ethan, it felt as if time itself had paused. He stared at the screen in front of him, the list of speakers for the day displayed prominently, yet his thoughts were elsewhere. The pressure of the past weeks, the relentless threat of his past catching up to him, it all seemed to converge on this one moment. This was their last chance. The world was watching, and everything would either change or come crashing down. Just when you thought the storm of emotions had peaked, a heavy knock came at the door. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. He turned to see Tyrell standing there, his eyes steady and filled with determination. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice heavier than he intended. It wasn't just Tyrell who needed to prepare. This moment would define them both. Tyrell nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. "It feels too big, Ethan." What if I can't live up to the expectations? Ethan took a deep breath, looking at the young man he now called his mentor. No one expects you to be perfect, Tyrell. This isn't about their expectations. This is about you. You've earned your chance. And if you don't take it, I don't know what else will. Tyrell looked back at Ethan, his gaze fierce. He was right. This was more than a moment. This was their chance to change everything, not just for themselves, but for those watching them. The world would judge them, but what if they seized the opportunity and exceeded everyone's expectations? And just when you thought the tension might become unbearable, the lights in the hall turned on. The event's introduction began. This was the moment when everything they had built would be put to the test. The crowd, bustling and noisy, fell silent as the first speaker took the stage. Ethan and Tyrell stood backstage, nerves gnawing at them both. Ethan felt a chill run through him as he heard Tyrell's name announced. This was the moment of truth. "Tyrell Johnson, ladies and gentlemen," the host's voice boomed through the speakers. Tyrell stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding, but with a resolve he hadn't felt before. The lights were bright, the crowd watching, but he no longer felt like an unknown boy. This was his moment. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Tyrell Johnson," he said, his voice strong and steady. "I'm here because I believe everyone deserves the chance to grow. Not because I'm better than anyone, but because I know what it's like to fight for everything you have." Just when you thought he had found his rhythm, a man stood up from the audience. His posture was unfriendly, his gaze sharp. "Tyrell," he said with a sneer, "what makes you different? What do you think you're doing here? Do you really think your story can bring the change we need?" Tyrell felt his breath catch in his throat. This was the challenge he had expected, but he wouldn't falter. Not now. "What makes me different?" Tyrell began, his voice now firm. "Because I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for everyone who has ever stood in the shadows. Everyone who wasn't heard because they were told they didn't have a chance." The room went silent. Tyrell's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan stood at the back, a strange sense of pride coursing through him. Tyrell hadn't just answered the question, he had challenged the room. This wasn't just a boy responding to a question, this was a young man taking control of his life's direction. "This is my moment," Tyrell continued, "and if you don't understand that, then you can't stop me." The room filled with tentative applause. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was enough. Tyrell had made his mark. What would follow now was up to him. Just when you thought the confrontation was over, another journalist stepped forward. Her eyes darted to Tyrell, but she directed her question squarely at Ethan. "Mr. Cole, what do you think of this new turn? Do you believe Tyrell can truly bring about the change he promises?" The question cut through the tension. Ethan felt the eyes of the world on him once again. But instead of retreating, he turned to the journalist, his expression resolute. "Tyrell has proven himself," Ethan said, his voice full of conviction, "and what he's achieved is more than I could have done. But I believe in him. He has the chance to show that change is possible, if we choose to make it happen." The room erupted in unexpected applause, much stronger than before. Ethan felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. This was their moment. The storm wasn't over, but it was now Tyrell's storm to lead. Tyrell glanced at Ethan, his eyes filled with renewed determination. They stood together, but Tyrell knew the fight wasn't over yet. What if the truth still pursued them? What if they failed? Just when you thought things were settling down, the door behind them opened. An unfamiliar staff member approached, his expression a mix of concern and urgency. "Mr. Cole," the staff member said quickly, "there's something you need to know immediately." Tyrell looked at Ethan, his gaze both questioning and tense. What now? What more could this bring for them? But just as the door closed behind them, Ethan realized that this moment, as challenging as it was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. The past hadn't forgiven them, but it was now up to them to rewrite the future. The room was heavy with tension. Ethan felt the breath catch in his lungs as the staff member entered, holding an envelope. Her expression was nervous, her hands trembling slightly, mirroring the unease in the air. Whatever was inside that envelope, Ethan knew it would change everything. Tyrell stood beside him, his eyes sharp and expectant. Ethan felt his own heart race. The press, his past, everything seemed to converge in this one unavoidable confrontation. The photo he had hoped would never resurface was now about to define his life forever. "You need to see this," the staff member said, her voice fragile. Ethan took the envelope from her hands, his fingers trembling as he opened it. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the photo came into view. It was a black and white image from years ago, a younger version of himself, taken shortly after closing his first major deal. The words beneath it were simple but devastating. The deal that destroyed small businesses. Ethan felt his breath hitch. The photo was a dagger to his chest, but it was the caption that truly broke him. The memories came flooding back like a wave. He saw himself as the young, ambitious man he had once been. His gaze hard, singularly focused on success, no matter the cost. Tyrell stood there, his eyes fixed on Ethan. The joy he had felt earlier, the relief from their shared victory, was gone. The reality of what lay before them hit them both like a storm. "What does this mean?" Tyrell asked, his voice cold and tinged with worry. He was the boy who had believed in Ethan, but now they faced the greatest challenge of their lives. "What's really going on?" Ethan looked up, his face etched with guilt. This was his past. This photo wasn't just a memory, it was evidence of what he had done, the lives he had destroyed in his relentless pursuit of success. He sighed deeply, his voice breaking as he began to speak. "This is the truth, Tyrell," he said, his words heavy with pain. "This is who I was. These are the choices I made. I made deals, Tyrell, deals that destroyed businesses, cost people their jobs, all so I could climb the ladder faster. And I said nothing. I looked the other way while people were crushed by the fallout of my actions." Just when you thought he might crumble under the weight of his past, Ethan straightened his shoulders. This was his moment to not only reveal the truth, but to try to make amends. He looked at Tyrell, his gaze filled with both remorse and determination. "I hurt so many people, Tyrell," he said, the words coming slowly, each one heavy with meaning. "I didn't see what my choices really meant for the people I left behind, but I can't undo it. What I can do is try to make right what I've ruined." Tyrell stared at him, his face a mixture of doubt and understanding. It was clear he still respected Ethan, but the realization that the man he admired wasn't perfect cut deeper than he had expected. "Ethan," Tyrell said slowly, his voice soft but firm, "you gave us a chance, but you also messed it up. You could have helped those people, but instead, you chose success over them. Why?" Ethan felt the sharp edge of the question. It was a painful mirror he could no longer avoid. Why had he made those choices? The rush to reach the top? The fear of not being enough? The compulsion to control everything, even at the expense of others? Just when you thought Ethan couldn't bear the weight of his emotions any longer, the room filled with a new urgency. The staff member who had brought the envelope spoke again, her tone urgent. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her words, "the press has already caught wind of the photo. They're waiting outside. They want answers." Ethan felt the pressure in his chest rise, his breath catching in his throat. What could he say? How could he explain his choices? The past was here. It was inescapable. This wasn't just a question anymore. This was the potential destruction of everything he had built. Or perhaps his final chance to make things right. Tyrell looked at Ethan, his eyes a mix of doubt and understanding. "This isn't who you are now, is it?" he asked softly. The question cut through the silence, putting everything on edge. Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "No, this is who I was. But I'm not that man anymore. I'm not the man who sacrifices everything for his own gain. And I know it might be too late to fix it, but I want to try." The words hung heavy in the air, their weight palpable. Tyrell stood there, his fists clenching at his sides. This wasn't an easy situation, no clear choice to make. The truth had caught up to them, but Tyrell's expression held something unexpected. Not anger, but determination. "What if we do it differently?" Tyrell asked suddenly, his voice filled with resolve. "What if we go out there together? What if we tell our own truth instead of waiting for others to define it?" Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. This was what they needed. This was what he needed. The support of someone who believed in him even after everything he had done. Tyrell had shown him that it wasn't too late to choose change. "We'll do it together," Ethan said, his voice now firm with conviction. Just when you thought they had made their decision, the door to the room opened. Lights flashed like a storm ready to blind them. The press was waiting, cameras poised. The questions would come. But now Ethan knew he wasn't alone. He had something far more powerful on his side. The truth, his own truth, which he would no longer hide. With Tyrell beside him, Ethan stepped out of the room, knowing that this moment, no matter how difficult, was the beginning of something new. And with every step they took, the future drew closer. The lights flashed brightly above them, the sound of cameras clicking and microphones buzzing filled the space like a storm. Ethan could feel the eyes of the world on him. Every move he made, every breath he took was captured and scrutinized. This was the moment where everything would change. His heart pounded in his chest, but his feet stood firmly on the ground. Alongside Tyrell, he had prepared for this, but now everything was on the line. This was their final chance, not just to tell their story, but to rewrite the future. The doors to the room opened, the hall filled with the noise of dozens of journalists, their questions ready, eager to strike. The tension was palpable. Ethan felt the weight in his chest as he glanced at Tyrell, who stood beside him. The boy who had once been uncertain now seemed unshakable. He had proven himself, and together with Ethan, he faced the crowd, ready to define not just their own future, but the impact they would make. Not just when you thought the tension had reached its peak, Ethan turned to Tyrell. The room was silent, the journalist's eyes fixed on them, but the only sounds Ethan could hear were the quickening of his own heartbeat and Tyrell's steady breathing beside him. "You've made your choice," Ethan said softly, his voice trembling with the weight of the moment. "What we do now changes everything." Tyrell nodded without hesitation. "I know," he said, his gaze unwavering, filled with a determination Ethan hadn't expected. "This is my moment. This is what I wanted, even when I didn't know it was possible. But you've shown me I don't have to be afraid." The silence that followed was charged, but Ethan felt an unfamiliar calm wash over him. This wasn't just his fight, it was their fight. Together they would show the audience what they could achieve. Together they would face the past and prove it wouldn't hold them back. The host introducing them was a woman with a sharp gaze and a professional smile that didn't mask the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Cole, Mr. Johnson," she began with a calm yet piercing tone, "the world is watching you. Your story, your choices, the revelations that have surfaced over the past weeks. What would you like to say to the public? How do you see the future?" Tyrell spoke first, his voice steady and clear, free of doubt. "What I share now is my truth, and that's what I want everyone to understand," he began. "I'm here not because I believe I'm better than anyone else, but because I know change is possible. Not by hiding the past, but by facing it and moving forward with it." Ethan looked at the young man who had become his mentor, his heart swelling with pride. Tyrell was no longer the boy he had once been. This was a new Tyrell, someone who had found his voice and was no longer afraid to be heard. These words weren't just spoken, they came from his soul. The journalists in the room were silent, but after a few seconds, a soft applause began to ripple through the crowd. It wasn't thunderous, but it was enough to show Tyrell that his message hadn't gone unnoticed. Just when you thought Tyrell's words might fill the silence, a journalist stood up from the audience. His face was inscrutable, but his voice was sharp. "Mr. Cole," he asked, "the revelations about your past have made many people question you. You're accused of damaging other businesses for personal gain. How do you think the world sees you now?" The question cut through the air like a blade. Ethan felt his breath hitch. The eyes of the room were no longer on Tyrell, they were on him. This was his moment of truth. What could he say? What would he say? The weight of his past felt like an anchor dragging him down. But this wasn't the moment for excuses. This was the moment to tell it all. Tyrell looked at Ethan, his gaze no longer that of a boy dependent on a mentor, but of someone ready to face this fight alongside him. Ethan met his gaze and felt an unexpected sense of relief. "I've made mistakes," Ethan said, his voice steady. "There are things I've done that I'm not proud of. But those mistakes don't define who I am. What I do now, what we're doing now, that's what matters. This is our chance to change the future." The room was silent. The quiet was almost unbearable. The eyes of the world were on them, but Ethan knew this was the only way forward. Not by denying the past, but by acknowledging it and moving forward. Just when you thought the truth might consume them, a loud chime rang out. The door to the room opened and a staff member stepped in. "Mr. Cole, there's something you need to hear," she said, her voice urgent. "It could have a major impact on the future." Ethan felt a new wave of tension grip him. What now? Had the past finally caught up to them? What would this mean for them? Tyrell glanced from Ethan to the staff member, his eyes wide with curiosity. "What is it?" he asked cautiously. "There's a proposal," the staff member said. "An international network is interested in what you're doing. They want to involve you in a project for the future of young entrepreneurs. They want Tyrell to be the face of the initiative." Tyrell's expression shifted from surprise to determination. "What does this mean for me?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity and hope. Ethan felt a knot in his stomach. This was the opportunity he had hoped for, but did he truly have the courage to embrace it? He looked at Tyrell, his young mentor, who was now not only his equal, but someone who might bring about a world of change. "It means you can do whatever you want," Ethan said, his voice full of conviction. "This is your moment, Tyrell. You have the power to seize this chance." Tyrell smiled, a spark of hope lighting up his eyes. "We'll do it together," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "This isn't just my chance. This is our chance." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with pride. The future was uncertain, but he knew they had everything they needed to make the most of this opportunity. Whatever they did next, it would be their choice. Together, they would show the world that it's never too late to change. Just when you thought the future had become clear, Ethan still felt the weight of the world's eyes on him. But instead of fear, he felt determination. The storm wasn't over yet, but together they could face it. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Want to see more inspiring stories like this? Subscribe, leave a comment, and stay tuned for our next videos.